I just said two regions when we were here to talk about one region, which is Southeast Asia.
But it comes back
That's
to
right.
our point about this is a
Right.
region that is so diverse
Right.
that it could really be spliced in a number of different ways,
Right.
right? That's just one of the most obvious,
Yeah,
in a way,
yeah.
but there are many other ways.
Yeah.
Well, here we are, Paul. And we've been invited, of course, to help kick off the Southeast Asia Institute Student Research Symposium for the 26th of November by having this curated conversation.
Yeah, well, let me
us.
start by saying I regret that I won't be there in person, but this is second best, and grateful for the chance to have this conversation.
Yes, and we're very, very glad that you've made yourself available for this pre-recording
My
as
pleasure.
well.
Yeah.
As we all know, we've tried to approach the symposium with a bit of an organizing theme. And one of the key elements of research into Southeast Asia that we're very, very keen to explore in this symposium as a whole is that question of, given the diversity
Right.
and the manifold challenges involved in studying such a widespread and
Right.
diverse region, how do we go about carrying out research on Southeast Asia as a region, right? And so Paul and I have agreed that we will kick off some of this exploration in this opening session in the form of a conversation. We've also agreed that
Coming from different disciplinary
Coming from
backgrounds,
different-
which
yes.
should make it even more fun and interesting.
Yeah, and also very different,
Yeah.
career engagements with the region. And we've agreed that in the interest of time and coherence, we'd like to sort of structure our conversation around 3 questions,
Right.
which will hopefully give us different ways to cut at this question
Right.
of what does it mean to be studying Southeast
Right,
Asia as a
right.
region. So does it make sense to you, Paul,
Yeah,
if
sounds
we
good.
begin with the first question? So Paul and I thought that one way to begin this exploration is to think about what's the difference between being a country specialist, which many of us are, of course, and being a regional specialist, right? And second question kind of related to that, sub-question related to that, what are the connections between being a country specialist and then being a regional specialist in the
Right.
Southeast Asian context? I'd like to invite Paul to start first,
Sure.
because Paul is both a country specialist and a regional specialist.
Yes, I'm a scholar of comparative politics and Southeast Asian politics, and I have particular country expertise on the Philippines. So I have always wanted to examine my country specialization both within regional perspective and more broadly within the field of comparative politics with all of the other theoretical and comparative literatures that we can draw upon. So I think in a nutshell, I think it's very difficult to be a regional specialist without taking into account the extraordinary country diversity of Southeast Asia. And it's a big mistake to be a country specialist and not to be looking regionally for the extraordinary diversity that one finds within Southeast Asia. Now let's just sort of think about it in terms of if we were sitting here and having a conversation about Latin America. Now there's a great deal of diversity across Latin America as well, but there's a certain commonality in terms of the Iberian colonial background and a one dominant religion throughout the entire continent. Now compare that to Southeast Asia, where of course there are such a diverse range of colonial backgrounds, French and British and Dutch and Spanish/American, and then the Siamese example of not having formal colonial rule. There's so much diversity in terms of the dominant religion within countries, from Buddhist to Muslim, Buddhist majority to Muslim majority to Christian minority. But then I'm being very careful. We have to think about all the minority religions that exist within each country as well. And there's such a diversity within Southeast Asia as a whole in terms of its political regimes. So as a scholar of politics, there's a variety of authoritarian regimes, sometimes Leninist party states, sometimes military regimes. There's a variety of democratic regimes. There's monarchical regimes. There's such a variety that it's actually, if you want to speak of Southeast Asia as a region, you of course need to look at the diversity that exists country by country in order to understand that region. And that's one thing I think that makes it such a fascinating place for us. But likewise, for someone like myself who has a strong country specialization, I would be missing out on all sorts of insights if I didn't also look comparatively at other situations. So going way back in my career, from my dissertation through my work in territorial politics and patronage politics and urban politics, I've always learned so much by being able to do research not only in the Philippines but also Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. And even if I wasn't doing, in my dissertation work, even if I wasn't doing direct primary research in other countries, I always had them in the back of my head, and it always informed my framework. So much more I could say about that in terms of the ways in which that has influenced me. But I guess one other point I'd highlight would just be that when I think about comparison, I often have to go back to concepts. And I have to not just think about concept formation, but concept reformulation. So that led me early on, when I was thinking about types of capitalism, to say, well, the standard typology of status versus laissez-faire doesn't work. We need to think of some other types. When I was thinking about territorial politics, what do we really mean by decentralization and centralization? And isn't it distinctive in the administrative versus the political sphere? Or then when I'm thinking about money politics, what do we mean by patronage and clientelism? Why do these terms always get conflated? Why do they always get tangled up? We need to pull them apart. And by thinking about refinement of concepts, it's really assisted me in the comparative venture. And then it's also, I think, helped all of us who've been working together on various projects then to be able to make contributions to the global study of politics, using Southeast Asia as our base. So just in sum, you can't be a regional specialist without being a country specialist, and you are missing out on so much if you try to be a country specialist and you don't take advantage of the diversity around you.
Oh, there's so many things to say, right, in response to that, and in contrast to that as well. But I'll just give you my reaction first to what you just said. To me, it sounds like what you're saying is that Southeast Asia, you know, in its multiple dimensions of diversity, both in country and across region, really functions pretty much as a pre-prepared, God-given almost, you know, petri dish of all sorts of things.
Absolutely.
And it's a microcosm, if you like, in and of itself.
That's right.
Of a huge variety of political, economic, social, historical things that could be observed.
Yeah, you name it, whatever you want to study, you can find it.
Observations, comparisons, contrasts, you do everything, really, in there, right?
Yep.
And I agree with you that that's such a wonderful promise of being a Southeast Asianist in any form, right? And here's where the counterpoint comes in. My journey, of course, to this is from completely the opposite.
Of course it is, yes.
So what I've been trying to do, and I'll sort of put my hands up and admit this, is I've been trying to be a regional specialist without being a country specialist. So according to Paul, this is not possible. All right. And I don't necessarily disagree, and I've never really in my career tried to claim very hard to be a Southeast Asianist,
Right.
because I study more than just Southeast Asia.
Of course. Yeah.
But my engagement with Southeast Asia, my interest with Southeast Asia has from the beginning explicitly been from a regional perspective.
Right.
Because in my field of international relations, diplomatic history, geography and the environment, those are my fields. Southeast Asia is very often discussed and treated as a given region.
Of course it is.
Right?
Yes.
Like a containerized understanding of this part of the world. Aha, Southeast Asia, boom.
Yep.
We'd be able to produce the map. This is what
If
this
you're
is.
coming at it from a global perspective,
Right? Like,
you've
I'm
got the map.
problematic, here's the
Yeah.
region, And in a lot of my research and work, I've actually always tried to bust that, or at least to complicate that easy receptacle of, this is the region or the sub-region, and over time, of course, I've tried to do this in a variety of ways. One way is to obviously point to the diversity,
Right.
whether it's in strategic approaches, strategic cultures, colonial histories,
Right.
And how they relate to contemporary choices,
Right.
etc. The diversities of experiences and choices and leanings that may come out of
Right.
that.
Right.
So, to fudge the idea that here is one coherent, identifiable region that
Right,
we can
right.
conveniently say, oh yeah, they are this, right? So that's been one way. Another way, over time, is that I've actually come to closer to Paul's, kind of sense that one must have something of the country in order to be able to say sensible things
Right,
about the
right,
region.
right.
And I've been dragged into country studies almost kicking and screaming.
Right.
Because as an IR trained, international relations trained person, although I do foreign policy, I've always been a bit allergic to what I think of as domestic politics for the sake of domestic politics. You know how it is, right? IR people study domestic politics, and they do it so that they can understand foreign policy and international relations better. They're not interested in
Right.
so
Yeah,
much in
yeah.
domestic politics for its
Yeah.
own sake, right?
Yeah.
So I used to get confused and lost in the wilderness of Indonesian names, for example, if talking about Indonesian foreign policy.
right.
And that's what I mean by kicking and screaming. I always
Yeah.
felt that wasn't really my ken, and
Yeah.
I didn't know enough about it. I don't know
Right.
much about it. I can't do it. But over time, I've come to realize that
Right.
actually I need to at least develop knowledge about, discrete realms of national policy and politics.
Yep.
To be able to understand more broadly
Yeah.
regional patterns in, for example, how regional countries respond to China.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I was about to give an example from your own
Please.
work on Chinese investment in Southeast Asia, which in that terrific work that you did in recent years, and maybe you're still working
Yeah,
on
thank
it
you.
as well. To talk about Chinese investment in Southeast Asia requires differentiation. That the experience of Laos is different than Indonesia. Indonesia is different than Myanmar. Myanmar is different than the Philippines.
Yes, indeed.
Just in terms of scale, in terms
Yeah.
of types of projects.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so interesting
Yes.
for me.
Yeah.
Again, coming at it from country specialization and domestic politics and comparative politics,
Yes.
is reading your work and how it has that overarching focus on something regional, Chinese investment in
Yes.
Southeast Asia, but in order to understand that, you have broken it down.
Yes.
Now then, of course, you can pull it back together
Yes.
again and make some overarching comments.
Yes.
But to really study it, you need to have that combination. I don't think either of us are being very dogmatic here about one or the other. You need to be able to look at the combination of the regional trends as well as the country by country specificities. Yeah.
And I think the same thing happens for me when I read something like Money Politics, right? Because it's very, very clear that one can, as you said, do a great deal in terms of conceptual refinement and ultimate contribution to the broader field of
Right.
comparative politics and political science.
Yep.
If one actually had the in-depth, case comparison, which
Right.
of course is built on country specialization.
Yes, yeah.
Across this petri dish region,
Right,
as I
right,
said,
right,
and that is huge fodder already for
Yep.
being able to build a robust set of refined theories,
Yep.
right, about how patronage works.
Absolutely, yeah. And if I can just complicate things just a little bit further, when we were looking at the differences in the character of patronage politics in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, we had national level characterizations. They fit into country by country typologies, but we also had to have a section at the book, of a chapter of the book too, that looked at regional differences. So you can't understand Philippines as a whole without also looking at the ways in which patronage politics may play out different in certain urban areas that might be more inclined to programmatic politics, or in Mindanao or in Ilocos where you might have a particular strong inclination to
national
coercion.
Regions, national
yes,
regions,
so the you need to pull it down to the subnational, right. So also in our urban politics project that we've been involved in recent years, we have national level characterizations, but then when we're looking at, say, the character of government business relations at the city level and the relative strengths of government and business, or we're looking at the nature of coalitions, or we're looking at kinds of innovations, whether it be public-private partnerships or the like. Every one of our countries, we need to look at differences city by city. So you can find such variation between two Indonesian cities in terms of relative strength of government and business that are by no means the same. There's enormous amount of variation there. If we're looking at the nature of coalitions in Philippine cities, very different. We're looking at the take-up of PPPs, public-private partnerships, in Thailand. Enormous differences there. And then, of course, Malaysia. Think of the difference of, say, urban politics in Penang on one side of the peninsula and Kota Baru on the other, both of which are, not to mention Cebu in Sarawak, which is another one of our cities. So each of those has just fascinating differentiation that's there. So we're faced with, not just understanding the national, but also the variation at the subnational as well.
Again, like comparison is a word we use very often, right? But when we're engaged in doing that, I think we very often have slightly different purposes. And I'll give an example from things that I sometimes struggle with when trying to do comparisons. One way of doing it, of course, is as you've indicated, to identify a theme, right? Such as patronage or urban politics. Or in my case, maybe regime security, which is something I'm working on at the moment. And then to say, let's see how this works. Samely, but differently. Right, similarly, but differently in different parts of the region. And let's see what it tells us, right, about things that we can generalize. And I often find that the challenges for me in doing this in a region such as Southeast Asia is that there are almost endless possibilities, right? So coming up with the axes of comparison is problematic, right? And sometimes it almost seems arbitrary, what we pick as the main axes of comparison, and very often dictated by what kinds of theories we're trying to prove. Terrible, in my view, Secondly, the difficulty then...
And not just theories we're trying to prove, but also problems on the ground that we're trying to understand.
Yeah, that would be better,
too,
right? I was trying to say that would be better. And trying to pick the axes based on theories that we're trying to prove, to my mind, is suboptimal. Trying to pick axes based on things we observe on the ground and that we think might be generalizable is always my preferred approach, but deeply problematic. So I'll give you an example from what I'm currently trying to do. Like, if one does a project as I'm doing, trying to think about comparing ways in which regime security functions as an intervening variable, right, for how Southeast Asian countries respond to external incentives, let's put it that way. For me, it became a deep struggle in terms of how to think about, well, what is it that we're trying to compare when we talk about regime security? Because at one level, It's a very basic requirement. It doesn't matter whether you are a democracy or an authoritarian state of whatever stripe.
Right.
Right. There is something that we might approximate to what we might call performance legitimacy,
Right,
which is
right.
what's normally dealt with in the literature. But obviously the channels of how regime security are thought about and then pursued vary enormously
Right.
across, as Paul's already said, this wide range of, non-democratic as well as democratic electoral
Right. Right.
systems. So for me, it's always about the sort of comparators that become this difficult
Right.
choice. The other difficulty I have is always in thinking, well, am I comparing to look for difference, or am I comparing to look for similarities? Right? Because I think that skews a little bit what we then decide is significant observations.
Right. Right. Yep.
And I know that those are probably things that you deal with in your research as well.
Yeah, for me, I'd like to just highlight a few aha moments in the midst of research where, I think that those of us who have country specializations, whether it be Indonesia or Philippines or Vietnam, whatever it may be, we come to take certain things for granted.
Yes.
That we expect that's the way that we will see things in certain settings. So let me take something at a subnational level, just as what to expect when you go to City Hall. Okay? Now, for me, I'm used to seeing a City Hall in the Philippines which has throngs of people
Yes.
who are lining up at each of the city councilors' offices as well as the mayor's office asking for things, whether their grandchild has graduation and they need some money for shoes, or whether they have a funeral in the family, whatever it may be. It's a normal practice to come to the politician to ask for assistance, and it has been for a long time. It's just part of the job. We've had city councilors that tell us, people line up at his house at 5 a.m. So then we find ourselves at a city hall in Indonesia, right? And there we were interviewing the mayor, and I looked around and I said, where are the people? And it just did not have those people lining up. And I even said to the mayor, who happens to have a PhD in political science, I said, so how come you don't have a lot of constituents here? And he looked at me like, why would I have a lot of constituents here? And he actually responded by saying that would mean that our agencies aren't working properly, right?
Petition is the last resort.
Yeah, you wouldn't go to the same people in Indonesia if you are looking for help as you would if you are in the Philippines, right? So that was an aha moment that, okay, there are very different ways in which you have the dispensing of aid at the local level. Another came when we were at these are my experiences in Indonesia. I could tell stories in Malaysia as well, but where we were at in Indonesia at a urban ward, kelurahan level. And we were interviewing people there. And I realized all the people we're interviewing were civil servants, okay? And those of us who are Indonesia experts, of course, didn't think anything of that. But me, as a Philippine expert, said, wait a second. The barangay, the urban ward in the Philippines, if we were having a conversation at the barangay hall, we wouldn't be talking to civil servants because there aren't any civil servants at that local level in the Philippines. So it just sort of highlights that you have so much variation in terms of appointed versus elected. There's very stark contrast with Malaysia, where local elections have been out of the picture since the 1960s, right? You find differences in terms of the degree to which civil service operates at the local level, and you find differences in terms of how patronage gets dispensed. So a lot of things that you sort of take for granted with just your country specialization lens, when you're moving elsewhere, you realize, my gosh, this is amazing. And the Malaysia example is just what an extraordinary patchwork it is. I always thought that Malaysia is a fairly or quite a centralized system, so they must. I presume that centralized systems would have the same nomenclature and all, but no, Malaysia is just an absolute patchwork, depending on whether it's straight settlements, federated states, unfederated states, Sabah, Sarawak, and you have different configurations, actually in terms of levels and different terms that are used. So all of those things, for me, is part of the aha of comparison, of the way in which, oh my gosh, I never really thought about that. But when you're moving around in other realms, then you move back to, I moved back to the Philippines, and I talk to people, do you know how extraordinary it is that there's no civil servants at the local level? Why? Are there civil servants at that level elsewhere? Yes, there are. And, so it opens up a conversation about the way in which service delivery is hampered in the Philippines by the lack of effective civil service at that level.
I think the point here is that we're, in a way, when we try to do regional comparisons, we're all situated observers, aren't we, to some degree?
Of course, yeah, good point.
Our situatedness comes from either our deliberate country specialization, sometimes from our backgrounds, sometimes because of our work experience, etc. So I'm not a country specialist, but some way into my Southeast Asia journey, I realized that I had a situated view of Southeast Asian strategic choices, which I had not realized. And it was a maritime view.
Right.
And maritime Southeast Asian views of strategic choices, especially vis-a-vis great powers, come out of a very different framework than, say, mainland Southeast Asian perspectives on the same questions, right? Mainland Southeast Asian states are very much more, have their interests very much more refracted through their immediate bilateral or triangular relations with their immediate neighbors. And for them, China is very much more likely, like the United States or external European imperial powers, to be offshore balances. Right. Whereas maritime states have a little bit more of a tendency to see it the American way, which is to see themselves as positioned immediately between the U.S. and China. Because I'm grossly generalizing, but but there is this chronic difference between the mainland situation and the maritime situation. It took me a while to realize that I was operating out of a maritime mindset. While assuming that must be the norm. It's like your no civil servants at the barangay level norm. So yes, we suffer that, don't we?
And historians help us to understand that maritime versus mainland difference going way back, that the European colonial powers could come in and basically claim territory and become the hegemon in maritime Southeast Asia in the way that they couldn't in the mainland, because they had the naval superiority but not the land-based army ability until the 19th century to come in and to make a big influence, as they did in Burma starting in 1826, something like that. So these distinctions between maritime and mainland Southeast Asia is just another critical dimension of understanding Southeast Asia, and one that I integrate into my courses a fair bit as well, because it does give you a lens on so many different aspects of the experience of dealing with European expansionism and when the onslaught was felt in the two regions.
Indeed.
Very differently.
Again, this provides us, another nice...
I just said two regions when we were here to talk about one region, which is Southeast Asia.
But it comes back to our point about this is a region that is so diverse that it could really be spliced in a number of different ways, right? That's just one of the most obvious in a way, but there are many other ways. A nice pathway that opens up here for us to move into our third question, which is, to be more effective in studying this region, ought we then be lumpers or splitters, right? I put my hand out and confessed that I came up with this question, and I was inspired by, the famous sort of in diplomatic history and international relations, John Lewis Gaddis claimed that we can split Cold War historians into two types: lumpers and splitters. Right? Lumpers are the type who want to achieve sort of mid-level generalization, such as us saying mainland Southeast Asia versus maritime Southeast Asia, right? And splitters are the ones who want to see variations in variations, right? So my understanding is that splitters are the ones who
not
look
just
for
the alliance architecture of the Cold War, but the bilateral relations that underpin it.
Yeah, or not just one strategy of containment, but actually variations of that strategy of containment that go back and forth, And so, to my mind, if we were comparativists and we were splitters, what we would be really emphasizing are what are the differences in spite of what may look like generalizable phenomena, right? Well, still, what are the significant variations within that? And it occurs to me as a bit of a distinguisher, right? Whether we're lumpers or splitters, it seems to be motivated by what is our ultimate aim of studying the region.
True.
Right? And here, I think, if one were a country specialist, one might probably be more comfortable with the splitting exercise to be more specific and accurate for the case.
Perhaps, yeah.
Right.
I wouldn't put myself in the splitter
category.
I know you're by any means. Yeah.
I mean, that was what I was trying to get you to respond to.
Right.
Whereas for someone like me...
Nor am I a lumper.
That's good. That's good. You can be both, right? Or you can be neither.
Uh-huh.
I think I'm a lumper because my aim is always to look for some helpful mid-level generalization that helps us to shed light somewhere in that nexus between such diversity but still a region. Some stuff still holds it together and can identifiably be quite helpful as a generalization while we recognize the diversity, for example, right? And so in some of my earlier work, for example, on strategic choices, right? And of course, many other scholars have subsequently done so much more interesting work than I managed to do. But on this question of hedging, for example, right? It's no longer satisfactory, to simply say they hedge. Well, yeah, so does everybody, has always been my claim. Like, anyone who's got possibilities and options will choose to hedge. That's normal in international affairs. But we want to know, like, types of hedges, motivations for hedging, because they help us to identify parameters for how far some Southeast Asians might go in one direction, how far they might go in the other. It's about the scope of moving between the two. It's not the mere fact of moving between the two. So that kind of interest puts me, I think, in the sort of lumping within reason category, rather than splitting hairs over, is your hedging policy at this very moment different from your hedging policy from the last administration? Right. So to me, that's splitting hairs, right? There's a higher level of generalization to that. So Paul is neither a lumper nor a splitter. He's already told us. So we hear what he is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's useful to, in terms of certain questions, think about the region, but then as soon as you are thinking at that regional level, let's say about, I'm going to try to go trespass a bit into your territory. If we're thinking about the nature of Southeast Asian relations with China, hedging or not, each country has its own particular calculus. So it's very important to quickly move beyond the generalizations at the regional level and think about country by country dynamics as they exist. Now that's me trying to trespass into your territory. If we get back into the area of comparative politics, I could have chosen to be a country specialist. I could have chosen to work on the Philippines and nothing else. I could have chosen to not really care about bigger theoretical issues in comparative politics. But as much as I am fascinated with the Philippines, and I've been fascinated with the Philippines for a very long time, across 4 decades, I've never gotten bored studying Philippine politics, nor do I want to confine my focus to Philippine politics. That would make me a splitter if I put on the blinders and I only think about dynamics in the Philippines, because first of all, it would mean that I am not thinking about some of the broader regional issues that so-called lumpers may be focusing on, but it also would be pulling me away from comparative analysis. And there is so much that I've learned about the Philippines by comparing it with Indonesia, with Thailand, with Malaysia. There's so much that I have learned about the character of and you name the issue in terms of what we look at in comparative politics, whether it's issues of democratization or political economy or the character of corruption or central local relations or identity politics, you name it. If I were only to look at the Philippines, I would miss out on this extraordinary range of different experiences. And it's by engaging at that comparative level that I think it's forced me into what I was saying earlier, the conceptual refinement, reformulation, and those are the sorts of things that then make our study of Southeast Asia of interest to people who study, you name it, Brazil or India or Japan, anywhere in the world that you're also looking at those issues of state formation or democracy or territorial politics, whatever it may be. So that's why I like the categories for provoking thought, and I'm glad that you brought them in. But I would pretty strongly say that I don't want to be either.
That's good. I think that is helpful to think about it that way. It occurs to me, Paul, that there's another way in which, you know, as Southeast Asian regionalists, we could make a I don't know whether it's comparative politics or not. One of the things I've always tried to do with my work on Southeast Asia is to try and relate it and nest it into other adjacent and related sub-regions, right? So I don't just work on Southeast Asia. I work on how we might think of the Northeast Asian and Southeast Asian regions together, right? And of course, what we call this, we can debate. But the point is that the intersections strategically between the two regions, right? It's another way to kind of do to study a region, but in a broader context. So,
same story with me too. So even though I might say that my main regional focus is Southeast Asia, there's certain ways in which I have then brought in comparisons outside of Southeast Asia. So when trying to understand the character of the Marcos regime, I was interested not only in Suharto, but and I was thinking about a dissertation long ago on comparative cronyism in Indonesia and the Philippines. Not only Suharto, but then it drew me eventually into looking at Pak Chung-hee, two dictators that existed within the same historical era of the Cold War, and very different outcomes in terms of what they did with their economies. So I kind of had a 3-part comparison, Suharto and Marcos from Southeast Asia, bringing in Pak Chung-hee as a very different example too. Obviously someone who was far more successful, completely obsessed with national economic development goals, and someone who had, from what we can see, basically no record of serious corruption. You know, he might have had some money in his safe when he died, but that was to be able to pay off politicians. That wasn't for his own pocket, right? So it might say that, well, you can be a Cold War dictator and not be super corrupt, like whether it's Mobutu or Suharto or Marcos, 3 of the great kleptocrats of their time. And then in other work on looking at the character of central local relations. I've looked at Japan in comparison with Thailand and the Philippines, and that's where I kind of first got into the idea of these Japanese scholars, they keep calling it clientelism, and I think it should actually be called patronage. Right?
Yes.
So,
it's like from which end do you see this,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. So all of those things put me neither in neither category, but proudly a scholar of comparative politics, trying to understand a lot of issues, and ultimately realizing that politics is about real people and real places with a real impact, and wanting to address issues that can hopefully help us understand the world better and how to make it better.
And I think that would be something that would connect us, definitely.